Tonight, we are going to do something that sounds a little dangerous and a little unnecessary, which is exactly why it is perfect for bedtime. We are going to walk very slowly through a long staircase of philosophy concepts, from the most beginner-friendly ideas all the way up to the kind of thoughts that usually make people stare at ceilings, question furniture, and eventually decide to make tea. The good news is that you do not need to remember all of them. In fact, it may be better if you do not. This is not an exam. This is a gentle intellectual drift, a slow parade of ideas, a museum at closing time. And before we begin wandering among the exhibits, remember to quietly press sub if you enjoy this kind of sleepy storytelling, because nothing says deep reflection like supporting a channel while half-conscious. Let us begin at level 1 with the oldest and simplest question of all. What is philosophy, really? At its softest definition, philosophy is the habit of asking very basic questions that turn out not to be basic at all. What is real? What is good? What is a person? What can we know? What should we do? Why does any of this matter? It is, in some sense, the ancient art of politely refusing to accept the first answer. A child asks why the sky is blue. A philosopher asks what blue means, whether the sky exists independently of perception, and whether asking questions is itself a way of building a self. This is why philosophers are not always invited to cheerful dinners. Level 2 is wonder. Before arguments, before systems, before heavy books and footnotes, there is simple astonishment. Philosophy often begins not in certainty, but in surprise. The world is here. Consciousness is here. Time appears to move. Things change. Other people exist, somehow, with their own inner worlds, which is both comforting and mildly inconvenient. Wonder is not yet a conclusion. It is just the quiet realization that the obvious is not actually obvious. It is the moment you look at daily life and notice that it is, in fact, very strange. Level 3 is reason, the faith that the mind can sort things out at least a little. Reason is the tool philosophers use when they try to move from confusion toward clarity. It involves making distinctions, comparing claims, testing consistency, following implications, and trying not to contradict yourself in the first 3 sentences, though this remains an aspirational standard. Reason is not the same thing as being correct, but it is often the method by which one becomes less dramatically wrong. Level 4 is argument, not in the loud family dinner sense, but in the philosophical sense, a structured set of reasons intended to support a conclusion. In everyday life, people often think an argument is just conflict. In philosophy, an argument can be calm, elegant, even kind. Here are my premises. Here is the conclusion. Let us see whether the bridge between them holds. It is a very civilized way of wrestling, usually. Level 5 is logic, the study of valid reasoning. Logic asks whether conclusions follow from premises. If all humans are mortal and Socrates is human, then Socrates is mortal. This is tidy, satisfying, and not especially cheerful for Socrates. Logic is philosophy's skeleton. It helps keep ideas from collapsing into soft piles on the floor. Not all truths are discovered by logic alone, but without some logical discipline, philosophical thought turns into decorative fog. Level 6 is the difference between appearance and reality. Things seem one way and maybe another. The stick in water looks bent, but is straight. A person looks confident, but is terrified. A society looks stable, but rests on fragile assumptions and unpaid emotional labor. Philosophy becomes interested in that gap between how things present themselves and how they actually are. This gap is large enough to fit most of human history. Level 7 is the self. What are you exactly? Are you your body, your memories, your personality, your decisions, your stream of consciousness, your social role, your online search history, or something stranger and more difficult to pin down? The self feels familiar because it is always with us. But philosophy notices that familiarity is not the same as understanding. The I that seems so obvious may be more like a moving pattern than a fixed object. Level 8 is knowledge. Philosophers call the study of knowledge epistemology, which is a word that sounds like it should come with a candlelit basement and a large iron key. But the central question is simple enough. What does it mean to know something? Not guess? Not assume? Not feel very strongly on the internet? No. Traditionally, knowledge has often been described as justified true belief. You believe something, it is true, and you have good reason to believe it. Simple. Unfortunately, philosophy is never satisfied with simplicity for long. Level 9 is skepticism, the habit of doubting whether we know as much as we think we do. Skepticism is not cynicism, and it is not mere stubbornness. It is the disciplined suspicion that our senses, memories, and assumptions may mislead us. Maybe we are mistaken. Maybe our evidence is incomplete. Maybe our certainty is just confidence wearing a fancy coat. Skepticism can be unsettling, but it also keeps thought honest. It asks us to slow down before planting flags in uncertain ground. Level 10 is truth. What is it? Is truth correspondence between belief and reality? Is it coherence within a system of beliefs? Is it what survives inquiry? We use the word constantly, yet the thing itself is hard to hold. Truth is one of those concepts that seems clear until someone asks for a definition, at which point even the furniture begins to look worried. Still, philosophy persists because humans seem unable to live without some sense that there is a difference between what is merely said and what is actually so. Level 11 is belief. Beliefs are the things we take to be true. Some are carefully justified, others are inherited, absorbed, half-noticed, or carried around because they fit conveniently with our habits. Philosophy asks not only what we believe, but why. What evidence supports it? What assumptions hide underneath it? Which beliefs shape our lives without ever introducing themselves formally? A surprising number of them are sitting quietly in the background, running the show. Level 12 is doubt. Doubt is skepticism's softer cousin. It is the pause between claim and commitment. It says, perhaps politely, I am not fully convinced. Doubt can feel uncomfortable because it interrupts the human desire for neat answers. But doubt also creates intellectual space. Without doubt, there is dogma. With too much doubt, there is paralysis. Philosophy often lives between those extremes, trying to doubt enough to stay awake, but not so much that nothing can be done except lying on the floor contemplating uncertainty. Level 13 is curiosity. This may sound too gentle to be philosophical, but it is essential. Curiosity is the refusal to stop at the first layer. Why is justice valued? Why do societies obey laws? Why does beauty move us? Why does time feel faster as we age? Curiosity is the engine. Without it, philosophy becomes recitation. With it, even ordinary life becomes a field of strange and important questions. Level 14 is concept. A concept is a mental category, an abstract unit by which we organize experience, tree, justice, friend, freedom, cause, number. These are not individual objects but ways of thinking about many instances or relations. Philosophy pays close attention to concepts because messy concepts produce messy thinking. If we do not know what we mean by freedom, equality, personhood, or happiness, then our arguments about them may amount to highly confident fog. Level 15 is definition. To define something is to try to state what it is. Easy, in theory. Less easy, once people begin speaking. Definitions can be descriptive, showing how a word is used, or normative, showing how it ought to be used. Philosophers love definitions because they help expose confusion early. If two people are arguing about justice but mean entirely different things by justice, then they are not really disagreeing in the same room. They are just waving at each other from separate conceptual boats. Level 16 is assumption. Assumptions are the beliefs already in place before the conversation begins. They are the floorboards beneath our thoughts, often invisible, often creaky, sometimes holding up much more than we realize. Philosophy enjoys pulling up these floorboards, which can be intellectually useful and socially exhausting. What are we taking for granted about human nature, morality, progress, success, knowledge, or reality itself? Once assumptions become visible, they can be examined. Some survive. Others begin to look rather tired. Level 17 is contradiction. A contradiction occurs when two claims cannot both be true in the same sense at the same time. Philosophy treats contradictions seriously because a contradictory system can say everything and therefore nothing. If your view implies both that humans are completely free and that all actions are fully determined in exactly the same way, you may need to tidy the shelves a bit. Not every tension is a contradiction, but philosophy insists that if our thoughts pull in opposite directions, we should notice. Level 18 is coherence. A coherent view is one whose parts fit together. Coherence does not guarantee truth because a beautiful fiction can also be coherent, but it matters. A worldview full of isolated claims, patched together with optimism and caffeine, is less stable than one whose ideas mutually support each other. Philosophers admire coherence the way architects admire load-bearing walls. Level 19 is consistency, similar to coherence but narrower. Consistency means not contradicting yourself across cases. If you defend free speech only for people you like, your principle may be more decorative than real. Philosophy has an annoying but useful tendency to ask whether we apply our standards evenly. It is, in this sense, an enemy of convenient exceptions. Level 20 is clarity. Philosophy is often accused of being obscure, and sometimes the accusation is not entirely cruel. But at its best, philosophy values clarity intensely. To think clearly is to distinguish claims, define terms, trace implications, and strip away unnecessary haze. Clarity can feel almost moral. It is a respect for the subject, for the audience, and for the possibility that truth prefers not to be buried under 7 paragraphs of decorative abstraction. Level 21 is the examined life. This is the idea, associated with Socrates, that a good human life involves reflection. Not endless self-absorption, not obsessive analysis of every breakfast choice, but thoughtful awareness of how one lives and why. The unexamined life, he famously suggested, is not worth living, which sounds a bit harsh if someone is just trying to enjoy a sandwich in peace. But the larger point remains powerful. To live well, we must sometimes ask what well means. Level 22 is Socratic questioning. Rather than lecturing, Socrates asked questions that exposed weak reasoning, hidden assumptions, and overconfident claims. This method can lead to insight, humility, or mild irritation, often all three. The goal is not to humiliate, but to reveal. A person says they know what courage is. Socrates asks for a definition, tests examples, finds contradictions, and leaves everyone staring thoughtfully into middle distance. It is a noble tradition. Level 23 is wisdom. Unlike knowledge, wisdom is not merely having information or even correct beliefs. Wisdom involves judgment, proportion, timing, depth, and some sense of what actually matters. A wise person is not simply one who knows many things, but one who understands how to live among them. Philosophy has long treated wisdom as its horizon, even if actual philosophers sometimes resemble people who misplace the horizon in a footnote. Level 24 is ignorance. Philosophy begins, strangely enough, by taking ignorance seriously. To know that one does not know is already a kind of progress. Ignorance is not merely absence. It can also be structured, protected, emotional, political. People avoid knowing certain things because knowledge demands change. Entire societies can organize themselves around not looking too closely. Philosophy, in one of its less cozy moods, tries to look anyway. Level 25 is humility. Intellectual humility is the recognition that one may be wrong, limited, partial, unfinished. It is not self-erasure. It is simply proportion. The universe is large. Human brains are improvisational devices running on habit, pattern recognition, and occasional overconfidence. Humility leaves room for learning. It keeps belief from hardening too quickly into identity. It is one of the quiet virtues that allows thought to breathe. Level 26 is worldview. A worldview is the broad framework through which a person interprets reality. It includes assumptions about what exists, what matters, what humans are like, what counts as knowledge, and what sort of future is possible. Everyone has one, whether explicit or not. Philosophy helps bring worldviews into the open, which is important because unseen frameworks tend to govern life more thoroughly than visible ones. Level 27 is metaphysics, the branch of philosophy that asks what ultimately exists and what reality is made of. Do only physical things exist, or also minds, values, numbers, possibilities? What is time? What is causation? What is identity? Through change. Metaphysics is the grand attic of philosophy, full of very old questions, drafty abstractions, and boxes labeled being, which no one should open too quickly before bed. Level 28 is ontology, a close cousin of metaphysics, focused specifically on what kinds of things exist: objects, properties, events, relations, universals, numbers, souls, laws of nature, social constructs. Some exist independently, some depend on minds, language, or institutions. Some may not exist at all, though people get surprisingly attached to them. Ontology is a taxonomic dream, and for normal dinner conversation, a mild social hazard. Level 29 is materialism, the view that reality is fundamentally physical. On this view, everything that exists is matter, energy, or something describable in physical terms. Minds, consciousness, emotions, and thought are not separate substances, but phenomena arising from physical systems, particularly those inconveniently delicate organs inside our heads. Materialism has a certain stern elegance. It says the universe does not owe us mystery just because we are fond of it. Level 30 is idealism, the very different view that mind or consciousness is primary in some important sense. Perhaps reality is fundamentally mental. Perhaps what we call matter is dependent on perception or thought. Idealism does not necessarily deny the world, but it rearranges the order of explanation. Instead of mind emerging from matter, matter may be understood through mind. This is the sort of reversal philosophy enjoys, especially when everyone had just begun feeling settled. Level 31 is dualism, the view that mind and body are distinct kinds of thing. René Descartes made this famous by arguing that thinking substance and extended substance are different. Minds think. Bodies occupy space. The appeal is intuitive. Our inner life feels unlike mere machinery. The problem is interaction. If mind and body are truly different substances, how do they affect each other? How does a non-physical intention lift a physical hand? Dualism opens the door and then stands there frowning at the hinges. Level 32 is monism, the idea that reality is fundamentally one kind of thing rather than two or many. Materialism is one form of monism. Some forms of idealism are another. Monism seeks simplicity at the deepest level. Beneath appearances, perhaps everything belongs to one underlying order. Humans have always found this soothing. Even our confusion, apparently, may come from a single source. Level 33 is causation, the relation by which one thing brings about another. Fire heats the kettle whistles. You reflect, for some reason, on existence. But what exactly is causation? Is it a real connection in the world, a habit of expectation in the mind, or a pattern described by laws? Philosophy notices that cause is constantly invoked and rarely fully understood. We speak as if causation were obvious, then struggle to say what it is. Level 34 is free will, the idea that humans can genuinely choose among alternatives in a meaningful sense. This concept sits at the crossroads of morality, law, personal identity, and regret. If you are free, then your choices are yours in a deep way. If not, then blame and praise become more complicated. Free will has caused centuries of argument, most of it conducted by people who, regardless of theory, continue behaving as if other people should have known better. Level 35 is determinism, the view that every event is necessitated by prior causes and conditions. Given the past and the laws of nature, only one future is possible. This is a very efficient universe, though not always an encouraging one. If determinism is true, then your current thought, your last decision, and the fact that you once ate something regrettable at 11 p.m. may all have been fixed long before you noticed. Level 36 is compatibilism, the attempt to reconcile free will and determinism. Compatibilists argue that freedom does not require absolute metaphysical independence from causation. Instead, freedom may mean acting according to your own desires, intentions, and reasons without external coercion. Even if those desires have causes, the action can still be free in the relevant sense. This is philosophy's way of saying, perhaps the situation is complicated, but not hopeless. Level 37 is incompatibilism, the opposite view that free will and determinism cannot both be true. If all actions are fully determined, then true alternative choice vanishes. Or, if genuine freedom exists, then determinism must be false somewhere. Incompatibilists dislike conceptual compromise. One has to admire the decisiveness, even as the rest of us lie awake wondering whether our indecision was preordained. Level 38 is consciousness, perhaps the most intimate mystery of all. Why is there something it is like to be you? Why do brain processes come with subjective experience, with color, pain, memory, mood, longing, and the strangely specific embarrassment of remembering something awkward from 8 years ago? Consciousness is not just information processing, it is felt existence. Philosophy circles it with admiration and suspicion because it seems both utterly familiar and profoundly unexplained. Level 39 is qualia, the term for the felt qualities of experience, the redness of red, the bitterness of coffee, the softness of evening air, the ache in a muscle. Qualia are the textures of consciousness. They remind us that experience is not merely functional but lived. Philosophers debate whether qualia are irreducible, illusory, central, or overhyped. But once the idea appears, it becomes difficult not to notice the world's inner shading. Level 40 is personal identity. What makes you the same person over time? Your body changes, your memories shift, your values evolve, cells come and go, hair makes its own decisions, yet somehow a line of continuity persists. Or seems to? Philosophers have proposed memory, bodily continuity, psychological connectedness, narrative unity, and other criteria. None is perfect. The self, it turns out, is stubbornly difficult to pin to the table. Level 41 is the ship of Theseus, a thought experiment about identity through change. If a ship has every plank gradually replaced, is it still the same ship? If the old planks are gathered and reassembled, which ship is the original? Apply this to persons, institutions, cities, languages, or your favorite sweater after repeated repairs, and the question becomes surprisingly invasive. Identity may not be a simple matter of material sameness, but if not, then what grounds it? Level 42 is mind-body problem, the broader challenge of explaining how mental states and physical states relate. Are thoughts brain events? Are they patterns, functions, emergent properties, or something non-physical? How does intention connect to action? How does matter produce meaning? The mind-body problem is philosophy at its most central and most difficult, which is perhaps why it keeps returning like an unpaid philosophical bill. Level 43 is empiricism, the view that knowledge begins primarily with experience, especially sensory experience. We see, hear, touch, test, and from this build understanding. Empiricists are suspicious of grand ideas floating free of observation. They want contact with the world. Show me, measure it, experience it. This has a practical charm. It also assumes, of course, that our experiences are reliable enough to support knowledge, which skepticism continues to mutter about in the background. Level 44 is rationalism, the view that reason itself can yield substantial knowledge, sometimes independently of sense experience. Mathematics is often the favorite example. Perhaps the mind contains structures or principles that allow it to discover necessary truths. Rationalists trust the architecture of thought more than empiricists do. They are less impressed by the mere fact that something feels obvious in daily life. After all, daily life has been wrong before. Level 45 is a priori knowledge, knowledge available independently of particular experiences. If all bachelors are unmarried, you do not need to inspect every bachelor in person. The truth follows from the concepts involved. A priori knowledge is often linked to logic, mathematics, and analytic truths. It is neat, indoor knowledge. It requires no mud. Level 46 is a posteriori knowledge, knowledge that depends on experience. Water boils at a certain temperature under certain conditions. This tree is taller than that one. The train is late again. Such knowledge comes through observation, experiment, and encounter. Much of human life depends on it. Philosophy distinguishes the a priori and a posteriori not just for tidy classification, but because it helps reveal the different ways minds connect with the world. Level 47 is induction, the reasoning by which we infer general patterns from particular cases. The sun has risen every day, so we expect it tomorrow. Bread has nourished us before, so we trust it again, perhaps too generously. Induction is essential to science and ordinary life, but philosophy notices a problem. Past regularities do not logically guarantee future ones. We rely on induction constantly because existence would otherwise be unmanageable, but rational certainty remains elusive. Level 48 is deduction, reasoning in which the conclusion follows necessarily from the premises if the form is valid. Deduction offers stronger certainty than induction, but only if the premises are true. If all dragons are accountants and Harold is a dragon, then Harold is an accountant. Perfectly valid, entirely unhelpful. Deduction preserves truth. It does not generate good premises out of thin air. Level 49 is inference to the best explanation, a more flexible style of reasoning in which we choose the explanation that best accounts for the evidence. Why are the streets wet? Perhaps rain, perhaps sprinklers, perhaps an ambitious philosophical metaphor. We infer the most plausible cause. Much human reasoning works this way. It is not airtight, but it is often sensible. Philosophy studies it because so much of knowledge rests not on certainty, but on comparative fit. Level 50 is skepticism about the external world. How do we know the world exists as we perceive it? Perhaps we are dreaming. Perhaps we are brains in vats, stimulated into experience by unknown forces. Perhaps reality is simulation, or perhaps it is merely Tuesday. Radical skepticism challenges our confidence that perception gives us the world as it is. Most people do not live as skeptics for long, partly because crossing roads requires commitment. Still, the challenge remains philosophically potent. What justifies belief in an external reality? Level 51 is realism, the view that the world exists independently of our minds. Mountains do not vanish when unobserved. Truth is not manufactured by preference. Electrons do not consult our feelings before behaving inconveniently. Realism has immense intuitive appeal and underlies much science and ordinary practice. Yet philosophy reminds us that accepting realism does not solve all questions about how we access reality, only that reality is not politely waiting to be invented by our opinions. Level 52 is anti-realism, the family of views that reality, truth, or meaning in some domain depends more heavily on minds, language, practices, or verification than realism admits. In ethics, mathematics, or even science, anti-realists question whether there are fully mind-independent facts of the matter. This does not always mean nothing is real, though people enjoy accusing it of that. It often means reality is more entangled with human frameworks than common sense likes to admit. Level 53 is relativism, the idea that truth, value, or justification may vary across cultures. frameworks, or individuals. Relativism begins as a recognition of diversity and ends quite often in administrative difficulties. If morality is relative, can we criticize any culture from outside it? If truth is relative, does that claim itself apply relatively? Philosophy presses relativism hard because, while it captures something important about perspective, it also threatens to dissolve standards entirely if not handled carefully. Level 54 is objectivity, the attempt to know or judge independently of individual bias, preference, or position. Perfect objectivity may be impossible for finite beings with histories, moods, and poorly timed hunger, but the aspiration matters. Objectivity is less about becoming nowhere and more about testing claims against shared methods, evidence, and critical scrutiny. It is a discipline of stepping back from oneself, which humans manage unevenly, but need badly. Level 55 is subjectivity, the perspective-bound character of experience and judgment. Every person encounters the world through a situated consciousness, with its own history, body, language, emotions, and blind spots. Subjectivity is not a flaw to be erased, but a condition of being human. Philosophy asks how subjective experience relates to public truth. This tension runs through aesthetics, ethics, politics, and knowledge itself. We are creatures who must think from somewhere while trying to understand things beyond ourselves. Level 56 is phenomenology, the philosophical study of lived experience as it appears to consciousness. Rather than starting with abstract theories about the external world, phenomenology attends to how the world is given in perception, memory, embodiment, time, and relation. What is it like to wait, to hope, to touch, to be looked at, to inhabit a body, to move through space as a meaningful world rather than a set of coordinates? Phenomenology slows thought down until experience begins to reveal its structure. Level 57 is intentionality, not in the sense of determination, but in the philosophical sense that mental states are about something. Thoughts refer, desires aim, fear fears, memory remembers. Consciousness is directed beyond itself toward objects, ideas, possibilities, absences. Intentionality is one of the strange marks of mind. A rock is not about Tuesday. A belief about Tuesday is. This directedness makes mental life distinctively relational. Level 58 is embodiment, the idea that minds are not ghostly thinking units floating free of flesh. We know, feel, and interpret the world through bodies. We are located, vulnerable, sensorily shaped, moved by posture, fatigue, temperature, rhythm. Even abstract thinking depends on embodied metaphors and capacities. Philosophy once treated the body as secondary. More recent thought gently reminds us that without a body, even lofty reflection would have nowhere to sit. Level 59 is language. Philosophy is deeply interested in language because so much of thought moves through words, concepts, grammar, categories, and shared usage. Language reveals and distorts. It allows reasoning, but it also traps us in habits of expression that feel natural only because we inherited them early and rarely interrogated them. Some philosophers even suggest that many traditional problems are really problems of language wearing fake philosophical mustaches. Level 60 is meaning. What makes a word, sentence, action, or life meaningful? In language, meaning may involve reference, use, intention, convention, context. In life, the question becomes more existential. Meaning is one of those terms used in multiple registers at once. which is deeply human and mildly inconvenient. Philosophy explores how meaning is generated, communicated, misunderstood, and searched for long after midnight. Level 61 is reference, the relationship between language and the things words point to. When you say moon, how does that sound connect to that bright object in the sky? Is reference fixed by intention, causal history, descriptive content, social usage, or some layered combination? Philosophy of language delights in these puzzles because everyday speech functions so smoothly that its underlying complexity remains almost offensively hidden. Level 62 is interpretation. Texts, actions, events, expressions, laws, rituals all require interpretation. Meaning is rarely delivered in sealed packaging. We infer, contextualize, compare, reconstruct. Interpretation sits between what is given and what is understood. Philosophy asks whether there is one correct interpretation, many plausible ones, or merely a polite struggle among historically situated readers with coffee. The answer depends inconveniently on the case. Level 63 is hermeneutics, the theory of interpretation. Originally tied to texts, especially sacred and legal ones, hermeneutics widened into a broader account of how understanding happens. We approach things with prior assumptions shaped by tradition, language, and history. Understanding is never entirely neutral or immediate. It is a dialogue between part and whole, past and present, reader and text. Even bedtime philosophy, sadly, is not free from hermeneutic conditions. Level 64 is analytic philosophy, a tradition emphasizing clarity, argument, logic, and often language analysis. It aims to break big problems into manageable pieces and distrusts unnecessary vagueness, the way a careful gardener distrusts ivy on old walls. Analytic philosophy can be illuminating, precise, and occasionally accused of draining the drama from existence. But for those who enjoy clean conceptual tools, it is a quiet pleasure. Level 65 is continental philosophy, a broad and somewhat awkward label for traditions more associated with history, culture, phenomenology, existentialism, critical theory, and large sweeping reflections on meaning, power, subjectivity, and modernity. It can be rich, poetic, difficult, and occasionally resembles being guided through a foggy cathedral by someone who refuses to use small words. The label is imperfect, but the contrast with analytic styles helps map philosophical temperament. Level 66 is dialectic, the movement of thought through opposition, tension, and development. In Plato, it is a method of questioning toward truth. In Hegel, it becomes a grand historical and conceptual motion in which contradictions generate higher syntheses. In ordinary life, dialectic is what happens when reality refuses simple binaries and insists on complexity. It is philosophy's reminder that opposing ideas may not always cancel each other. Sometimes they produce a deeper pattern. Level 67 is paradox, an apparently contradictory or absurd conclusion that reveals a hidden problem in our assumptions. This statement is false. If it is true, it is false, and if false, true. Very restful. Paradoxes matter because they expose cracks in logic, language, or concepts. They are not merely party tricks for overly alert minds. They show where our frameworks strain under their own weight. Level 68 is the Socrates paradox, also known as the paradox of the heap. Remove one grain from a heap of sand, and it is still a heap. Keep removing grains one by one. At what point is it no longer a heap? This puzzle targets vagueness. Many of our concepts, baldness included, lack sharp boundaries. Philosophy notices that ordinary language works surprisingly well despite this, which is both reassuring and suspicious. Level 69 is identity and difference. To identify something is to say what it is, but identity often depends on difference from other things. A chair is not a table. A self is not another self. Concepts gain meaning through contrast. Yet too much emphasis on fixed identity can erase change, relation, and nuance. Philosophy continually revisits how sameness and difference shape thought, politics, ethics, and existence. Level 70 is universals, the question of whether general properties like redness, justice, or humanity really exist beyond particular instances. Are universals real features of the world, mere names, or mental abstractions? Medieval philosophers argued fiercely about this, which is reassuring if you ever worry that your hobbies are too obscure. The problem matters because it touches how language, thought, and reality connect. Level 71 is nominalism, the view that universals do not exist as independent entities. There are only particular red things, not redness itself floating around in some abstract warehouse. General terms are useful labels, not references to separate realities. Nominalism is tidy and economical. It avoids mysterious entities. But critics worry it struggles to explain shared properties and objective similarity without smuggling them back in through the side door. Level 72 is realism about universals, the opposite position that universals are real in some sense. Different red apples participate in the same property of redness. Justice, in many cases, reflects something genuinely shared, not merely a linguistic convenience. This realism can take different forms, from Platonic to moderate. Its appeal lies in explaining commonality. Its risk lies in building an increasingly crowded metaphysical house. Level 73 is Plato's forms, one of philosophy's most famous attempts to solve the problem. According to Plato, beyond the changing world of appearances lies a higher realm of perfect, unchanging forms. Beauty itself, justice itself, the good itself, and so on. Particular beautiful things are imperfect participants in beauty. The idea is both grand and slightly unfair to ordinary chairs, shadows, and soup, all of which must now compete with ideal versions of themselves. Level 74 is the allegory of the cave. Prisoners sit in a cave, seeing only shadows cast on a wall, mistaking them for reality. One escapes, sees the outside world, and realizes the shadows were mere appearances. He returns to tell the others, who react poorly. The allegory is about education, illusion, truth, and the painful difficulty of awakening from familiar error. It remains powerful because humans are still very attached to their shadows, especially curated ones. Level 75 is Aristotle's virtue of moderation, the golden mean. For Aristotle, virtue often lies between extremes, courage between cowardice and recklessness, generosity between stinginess and wastefulness. The mean is not mathematical middle, but fitting balance relative to circumstance. This is philosophy in a practical, temperate mood. Do not have too little, do not have too much. Be proportionate, a concept with broad application, including perhaps dessert. Level 76 is teleology, the explanation of things in terms of purposes or ends. Why does the acorn become an oak? What is the function of the heart? What is the end of human life? Ancient philosophy often thought in teleological terms. Modern science became more cautious. Still, questions of function and purpose keep returning because humans are creatures who do not merely observe processes. We ask what they are for. Level 77 is virtue ethics, the ethical approach centered not primarily on rules or consequences, but on character. What kind of person should I become? What habits should I cultivate? Virtue ethics asks about courage, temperance, honesty, generosity, justice, practical wisdom. It treats morality as formation, not just decision. This gives ethics a long horizon. A good life is not a series of isolated right acts, but a shaped soul, which sounds dramatic but mostly involves repeated habits. Level 78 is eudaimonia, often translated as flourishing, well-being, or living well. For Aristotle, this is not mere pleasure or momentary happiness. It is the fulfillment of human capacities over a whole life in accordance with virtue. Flourishing is deep, stable, activity-based, and frankly, demanding. It asks more of life than comfort, yet it also offers more than amusement. One can almost hear Aristotle gently disapproving of doom-scrolling. Level 79 is Stoicism, the philosophy of focusing on what is within our control and accepting what is not. Stoics distinguish between our judgments, choices, and attitudes which are ours, and external events which are not fully ours. This can sound stern, but it is also calming. Do your duty. Govern your mind. Meet fortune without collapse. Stoicism is popular in every age because reality keeps refusing to become cooperative. Level 80 is apatheia, the Stoic ideal not of numbness, but of freedom from destructive passions that arise from false judgments. The Stoic is not a stone. He still cares, acts, and relates, but he seeks inner steadiness rather than emotional slavery to every external swing. This is harder than it sounds, particularly in traffic, politics, and family group chats. Level 81 is Epicureanism, often misunderstood as simple indulgence. In fact, Epicurus taught that the good life lies in modest pleasure, freedom from fear, and tranquility of mind. Not luxury, not excess, but calm sufficiency. Eat simply. Value friendship. Avoid unnecessary desire. Fear neither gods nor death too much. Epicureanism is philosophy in slippers, quietly unimpressed by status competition. Level 82 is hedonism, the view that pleasure is the good or the primary good. Hedonism has many forms, some crude, some refined. Philosophers immediately ask, which pleasures? For how long? Of what quality? At what cost? Human beings pursue pleasure readily enough without theory, but theory helps reveal that pleasure alone may not explain everything we value. Still, it remains a central part of ethical reflection, because to ignore pleasure entirely would be suspiciously theatrical. Level 83 is cynicism, originally an ancient philosophical movement advocating radical simplicity, independence from convention, and freedom from social pretenses. Later, the word came to mean distrustful pessimism about motives. The ancient cynics would probably be irritated by this change, though being irritated by society was already part of the package. Cynicism in its original form exposed the artificiality of status and comfort by living with almost shocking directness. Level 84 is skepticism in ethics, the worry that moral claims may lack objective basis. Do we discover moral truths or merely project preferences and social conditioning? Ethical skepticism can be intellectually sharp and practically alarming. It asks whether right and wrong are real or simply organized sentiment. Entire moral philosophies emerge in response to this discomfort. Level 85 is moral realism, the view that there are objective moral facts. Some actions really are wrong, regardless of personal preference or cultural approval. Justice is not merely applause with better branding. Moral realism gives ethics seriousness and authority. But it must explain where these facts come from, how we know them, and why humans disagree so enthusiastically despite their supposed objectivity. Level 86 is moral anti-realism, the denial that objective moral facts exist in the realist sense. Moral claims may express attitudes, prescriptions, emotions, or social constructions rather than independent truths. Anti-realism tries to be honest about the puzzling status of values in a physical universe, yet critics worry it leaves morality floating without anchors, which is rarely comforting. Level 87 is deontology, the ethical view associated most famously with Immanuel Kant, according to which morality depends on duty, rules, and principles rather than mere consequences. Some acts are right or wrong in themselves. Do not lie. Do not use people merely as means. Act only on maxims you could will as universal laws. Deontology respects persons and principle, though it can occasionally sound like morality wearing an extremely stiff collar. Level 88 is utilitarianism, the view that the right action is the one that maximizes overall happiness or well-being. Measure consequences. Count pleasures and pains. Choose the greatest good for the greatest number. Utilitarianism is elegant, democratic, and slightly terrifying when presented with trolley problems at inconvenient hours. It values outcomes, but critics note that individuals may feel alarmingly expendable inside a large enough calculation. Level 89 is the categorical imperative, Kant's famous test for morality. Can the principle behind your action be universalized without contradiction? And are you treating humanity in yourself and others always as an end and never merely as a means? It is a demanding moral lens. Convenient lies, manipulations, and selfish exceptions begin to look less charming under its light. Level 90 is rights, the moral or legal claims individuals possess that others ought to respect. Rights protect persons against misuse, exclusion, and domination. They structure modern politics and ethics profoundly. But philosophy asks difficult questions. Where do rights come from? Nature, reason, law, agreement, divine order, human dignity. Are there only negative rights against interference, or also positive rights to aid and provision? Once again, simplicity packs its bags and leaves. Level 91 is justice, one of philosophy's oldest and least settled questions. What does a just society owe its members? Equality, fairness, liberty, desert, welfare, opportunity, recognition. Justice concerns distribution, procedure, punishment, power, and respect. It is moral philosophy on a civic scale. Everyone approves of justice in principle. Agreement becomes less tidy once concrete structures appear. Level 92 is social contract theory, the idea that political authority is justified through some form of agreement among individuals, actual or hypothetical. Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and others use this framework to explain the state, rights, and legitimacy. The state is not just force. It is, ideally, a structure people would rationally consent to for mutual benefit or protection. Whether actual states live up to this elegant picture is, let us say, an ongoing matter. Level 93 is liberty, freedom from domination, coercion, or unjust constraint. But liberty comes in varieties. Negative liberty means freedom from interference. Positive liberty means the capacity or self-mastery to direct one's life. Political philosophies often split along this distinction. One side fears control. The other fears the hollow shell of freedom without power, education, health, or means. Both concerns are difficult to dismiss. Level 94 is equality, the principle that persons deserve equal moral consideration, though not always identical treatment. Equality can refer to status, opportunity, resources, rights, voice, or dignity. Philosophers debate what kind of equality matters most and how it can coexist with liberty, merit, and diversity. As with so many noble concepts, the word is easy and the design work is brutal. Level 95 is authority, the right to rule, command, or be obeyed. Not mere power, but justified power. Parents, teachers, governments, experts, traditions, institutions all claim authority in different ways. Philosophy asks when authority is legitimate and when obedience is warranted. This is useful because humans have a tragic talent for dressing power in respectable clothing and hoping no one notices. Level 96 is legitimacy, the moral or political rightfulness of institutions, rulers, or systems. A regime may have power without legitimacy, or some legitimacy without much competence, which is an awkward combination for everyone. Legitimacy depends on consent, justice, procedure, performance, tradition, or some mixture thereof. Political philosophy lives on these questions because life under authority is unavoidable, but rightful authority is not. Level 97 is alienation, especially in modern philosophy and social theory. The condition in which people become estranged from their work, society, community, bodies, or selves. What you do no longer feels like yours. What surrounds you feels external, imposed, hollow. Alienation is not simply sadness, it is disconnection structured into life. Modernity, with its scale, speed, and systems, has given this concept a long and rather busy career. Level 98 is existentialism, the tradition concerned with freedom, choice, anxiety, absurdity, responsibility, and the search for meaning in a world that does not hand us a script. Existence precedes essence, some existentialists say. We exist first, then define ourselves through action. This is liberating, burdensome, and not ideal for those who wanted clearer instructions. Existentialism insists that being human involves confronting freedom without guarantees. Level 99 is absurdity, particularly in Camus, the clash between our longing for meaning and the world's silence. We ask for order, justice, permanence, explanation. The universe offers weather, entropy, and occasional beauty. The absurd is not just nonsense, it is the tension between demand and response. Camus suggests we must imagine a lucidity that does not flee this condition. A strange form of dignity emerges when we stop expecting the cosmos to write us a comforting note. And finally, for tonight, we arrive at level 100, meaning itself, not just the meaning of words, but the meaning of a human life. Is meaning discovered or created? Is it found in truth, virtue, love, work, beauty, service, rebellion, transcendence, continuity, or attention? Philosophy has offered many answers and no final monopoly. Perhaps meaning is not a single object waiting behind a curtain. Perhaps it is something woven in relation between self and world, action and value, mortality and care. Perhaps a meaningful life is not one that solves every question, but but one that lives them honestly, gently, and with some degree of grace. A life that notices, a life that chooses with awareness, a life that does not mistake noise for depth or speed for purpose, a life that understands that certainty is rare, but responsibility remains. And maybe, on quieter nights like this, meaning is not even something to conquer. Maybe it is something to accompany. A low lamp in a large room, a steady breath in the dark, a willingness to remain present to the mystery without demanding that it perform tricks. If so, then philosophy is not merely a tower of concepts or an antique cabinet of arguments. It is a companionship with the deepest questions carried calmly through ordinary time. It is the art of becoming less asleep while learning, paradoxically, how to rest. When you look back over these 100 concepts, from wonder and reason to justice, freedom, alienation, absurdity, and meaning, a pattern begins to emerge. Philosophy is not just about complexity for its own sake, though it has certainly given that impression now and then, often at great length. It is about orientation. It asks how to stand in reality, how to think without panic, how to live without laziness of mind, how to care without illusion, and how to act in a world that is unfinished, unstable, and still somehow beautiful enough to keep us here. Some concepts sharpen the intellect, some humble it, some protect us against confusion, others expose us to it more honestly. All of them, in different ways, invite us to become more awake to the shape of existence. But since this is bedtime, and not a civic examination administered by stern immortals, you are not required to hold all 100 concepts in your head. You may let them loosen now. Let skepticism drift away. Let ontology put down its boxes. Let free will stop arguing with determinism for one evening. Let Plato keep his cave. Let Aristotle quietly balance his virtues somewhere else. Let Kant fold his principles neatly and place them on a chair. Let the Stoics exhale. Let the existentialists brood more softly. Let meaning itself remain unresolved and therefore, perhaps, alive. You do not have to finish philosophy tonight. Humanity has been trying for a very long time with only mixed results. For now, it is enough that you visited these ideas, enough that you moved among them slowly, enough that, somewhere between knowledge and doubt, self and world, duty and happiness, you felt the strange comfort of realizing that humans have always asked these questions. Across centuries and languages, under lamps and stars, in classrooms and courtyards, in monasteries and city apartments, in moments of peace and crisis, people have wondered what is true, what is right, what is real, and how one should live. You are not alone in asking. You are part of a very old, very tired, and sometimes surprisingly elegant conversation. So let the conversation dim now. Let the concepts become softer at the edges. Let them turn into distant rooms in a large and quiet house. Somewhere inside that house, reason is still awake, carefully sorting ideas. Somewhere, wonder is sitting by a window. Somewhere, truth is unbothered by our confusion. Somewhere, the self is less fixed than it imagined, and that may be all right. Somewhere, meaning is not shouting. It is simply waiting, patient as night, while you rest. And that is convenient because even after 100 concepts, philosophy still has the irritating habit of not being finished. It keeps opening side doors. It keeps revealing annexes, staircases, courtyards, and dim little passages where some soft-spoken thinker is still examining a question that should, by all reasonable standards, have been settled centuries ago. So rather than treating these 100 ideas as a completed tower, let us imagine them as a set of rooms in a very old building. A building with stone floors, drafty hallways, and a caretaker who has long since given up trying to direct visitors in any sensible order. You walk from truth into freedom, from freedom into language, from language into selfhood, and then somehow find yourself in a chamber full of paradoxes and candle smoke, wondering why the concept of identity has followed you in here. This is normal. Philosophy is rarely linear when it is alive inside a mind. It is more like weather moving across a landscape. One idea casts a shadow on another. A belief you thought stable begins to shift because of a question asked 3 rooms ago. You hear the word justice and suddenly remember free will. You consider the self and cannot avoid time. You think about meaning and immediately discover death standing quietly in the doorway, not making a fuss, just reminding everyone that deadlines give shape to value in ways eternity never quite manages. And so, as the night continues, we can slow down even further and let these concepts mingle the way they do in real life, where no one lives inside neat categories. In daily existence, epistemology gets involved when you read the news. Ethics appears when you speak to a stranger. Metaphysics arrives when you cannot sleep and begin wondering whether the person you were 10 years ago is genuinely you, or merely an earlier draft with worse opinions and different shoes. Political philosophy enters when you deal with institutions. Philosophy of mind enters when you ask why a memory can change the chemistry of your body from across a decade. Aesthetics arrives when music hurts in a pleasant way. Existentialism arrives whenever a Tuesday feels larger than it should. The concepts are not museum labels after all. They are currents moving through ordinary life, which is perhaps why philosophy survives every repeated accusation of uselessness. Even people who never read it still live inside its questions. Consider something as plain as promising. You tell someone you will do a thing tomorrow. Immediately, several concepts gather around the promise like mildly concerned relatives. There is personal identity, because the future self must somehow count as continuous with the present speaker. There is free will, because the promise assumes agency. There is morality, because keeping or breaking the promise seems valuable. There is time, because the promise stretches across it. There is trust, which depends on other minds being legible enough to rely upon. There is language, because the words must mean something shared. There is social contract, because a world of promises relies on norms larger than the individual speaker. There is truth, because one can promise sincerely or falsely. There is intention, because tone matters. There is responsibility, because once the promise exists, a new shape appears in the moral space between persons. One tiny sentence, and half of philosophy is already awake. The same thing happens with grief. Grief is not merely an emotion, it is a philosophical event. Someone dies or leaves or changes beyond recognition, and suddenly identity, memory, love, time, absence, meaning, embodiment, mortality, and value all begin moving at once. Grief teaches, in the least charming way possible, that persons are not objects. They are worlds of relation. When they vanish, reality is not just reduced, it is rearranged. A chair remains a chair when another chair disappears. A life does not remain the same when another life central to it is gone. This is why philosophy cannot remain purely abstract for long. The concepts may appear in books wearing clean jackets, but in lived experience They arrive muddy and emotional. Even logic, that dry old skeleton, matters more in life than it seems. Not because people walk around doing syllogisms at bus stops, though one should never rule anything out, but because unclear reasoning can damage a life. If you confuse shame with conscience, you may spend years obeying the wrong voice. If you treat every feeling as evidence, you may mistake anxiety for prophecy. If you assume success equals worth, you may build a self on applause and then wonder why silence feels like collapse. If you believe other minds are simple while your own is complicated, you become ungenerous. If you universalize your own tastes into truths, you become tedious. Logic is not the enemy of feeling. It is one of the tools that prevents feeling from becoming a tiny monarchy. Philosophy also asks us to notice scale. Many of our daily sufferings come from scale confusion. We treat temporary moods as permanent verdicts. We treat local failures as cosmic revelations. We treat a single embarrassment as if history itself will pause to preserve it. Philosophy, when functioning properly, adjusts the lens. Stoicism asks what is under your control and what is not. Existentialism asks what freedom remains even here. Buddhism, though not always included neatly inside Western philosophy courses, asks whether the self clutching so tightly at its anguish is as solid as it appears. Aristotle asks what a good life looks like across decades, not just this afternoon. Epicurus reminds you that modest pleasures and good company may outrank prestige in the economy of contentment. Nietzsche asks whether your values are truly yours or inherited furniture arranged by the dead. Marx asks whether your private misery has structural dimensions. Simone Weil asks whether attention itself is a moral act. Suddenly, the mind that felt trapped inside a single feeling discovers context. And context, though not always cheerful, is often merciful. Then there is the concept of attention, which deserves its own quiet room. Philosophy does not always foreground attention as a headline term, but many traditions depend on it. To attend is to direct consciousness deliberately, to notice rather than merely react, to remain with something long enough for it to disclose form. Most of modern life trains the opposite skill, skimming, flinching, switching, reaching, half-registering. But understanding is slow. Love is slow. Moral perception is slow. Wisdom is very slow indeed, almost offensively so. To pay attention to a friend in pain, to a line of poetry, to an injustice hidden in routine, to the way your own motives rearrange themselves under pressure, this is philosophical in the deepest sense. It is the refusal to let reality blur into convenience. In that sense, sleep itself has philosophical edges, not because dreams reveal universal truth every night, though they certainly enjoy pretending to, but because sleep reminds us that consciousness is not sovereign. We do not remain fully self-possessed. We vanish for a while into a condition where the will loosens, the world withdraws, and identity becomes less tightly held. There is something almost metaphysical in that daily surrender. The self that spends daylight insisting on continuity and control must, every evening, become unavailable. A small death, people have called it. That may be dramatic, but not entirely foolish. Sleep is a reminder that much of life is received, not achieved. You cannot bully yourself gracefully into unconsciousness, as many people discover while trying very hard. At some point, the mind must soften its grip. Philosophy can help here too, not by solving sleep, but by gently undermining some of the habits that keep wakefulness rigid. If the self is process rather than fortress, perhaps it can loosen. If control is partial, perhaps uncertainty need not be wrestled into the carpet. If the future is not fully masterable, perhaps tomorrow can be left in tomorrow's care. Even skepticism, properly sedated, may become calming. Do you know for certain what tomorrow brings? No. Very well then. Since certainty is unavailable, perhaps the body may rest without it. One of philosophy's oldest bedtime services is simply this: making room for not knowing without immediate panic. We might also wander now into the philosophy of time, because bedtime has always had a private treaty with clocks. Time is among the strangest things we inhabit. We speak of spending it, wasting it, saving it, losing it, as though it were a coin purse with delusions of grandeur. But what is time? A measure of change, a dimension, a form of intuition, as Kant thought, a flow as experience insists, a block universe, as some interpretations of physics suggest, where past, present, and future coexist in a structure our consciousness only traverses locally. The mind finds these possibilities both thrilling and inconvenient. Ordinary life feels like flow. One moment becomes another. Childhood recedes, the week disappears. But philosophy notices that our felt time and perhaps physical time may not be identical. Memory thickens some periods and hollows others. Waiting stretches minutes into moral trials. Joy collapses hours into droplets. Repetition makes years disappear. Novelty slows them. If identity is woven partly through memory, and memory is one of the organs by which time is lived, then the self is deeply temporal. You are not just a thing moving through time, but a being constituted by retention, anticipation, rhythm, and decay. This can sound unsettling until one remembers that rhythm is also where music lives. Mortality, then, enters not just as a grim endpoint, but as the condition under which time matters. If life were endless in the most ordinary sense, urgency would alter. Choice might diffuse. Commitment might lose contour. Later would swell until it absorbed everything. Finite life is tragic, yes, but also shape-giving. A novel needs ending to become a novel rather than an infinitely prolonged hallway full of side plots. A human life, too, acquires form because it cannot contain all possibilities. To choose this is to leave that. To love here is not to live everywhere. Limitation is not only deprivation, it is also the architecture of meaning. This is why existential philosophers take death so seriously, not merely as biological cessation, but as the horizon that transforms freedom from abstract openness into situated urgency. You do not have forever to become what you imagine becoming, hence responsibility, hence anxiety, hence occasionally a quiet kind of clarity. Of course, anxiety itself deserves attention. Anxiety is often described medically, socially, psychologically, all with reason, but it also has a philosophical side. Anxiety can arise not only from practical threats, but from freedom, possibility, uncertainty, and the naked fact that existence is not accompanied by guaranteed interpretation. Kierkegaard called anxiety the dizziness of freedom. That is wonderfully accurate. To be free is not simply to dance in open fields, it is to confront the vertigo of possible action. You could speak or remain silent, stay or leave, commit or postpone. Become this sort of person or another. Even refusing to choose becomes a choice with residue. Anxiety, in this existential sense, is not always pathology. Sometimes it is the atmosphere of meaningful freedom before it hardens into decision. This does not make it pleasant. Philosophy is not sentimental enough to pretend that naming a thing removes its weight. But the naming matters. To recognize existential anxiety as part of human structure rather than a purely private defect can reduce shame. One is not uniquely broken for feeling the strain of possibility. One is, to some extent, awake. There is also boredom, that underrated philosophical mood. Boredom sounds trivial until it expands. Superficial boredom is merely wanting stimulation. Deep boredom, however, can reveal a crisis of relation between self and world. When nothing grips, time thickens. Familiar activities drain of pull. The world does not vanish, but it becomes strangely unavailable. Some philosophers treat boredom as a window into modernity, emptiness, or the structures of desire, and perhaps bedtime itself knows this mood. A restless mind toggles from screen to thought, to memory, to imaginary future, not because it is deeply interested, but because it cannot bear the unadorned quiet long enough to discover what lies beneath boredom's first layer. Sometimes what lies beneath is fatigue, sometimes grief, sometimes fear, sometimes merely a mind untrained in stillness. Philosophy does not solve boredom by adding noise. It asks what boredom is revealing. Are you deprived of meaning or merely deprived of distraction? There is a difference, and confusing them has kept entire industries prosperous. We should also speak of friendship, because philosophy has often done so with more affection than outsiders expect. Aristotle considered friendship one of the greatest goods of life, not secondary decoration. A friend is not merely someone useful, pleasant, or geographically convenient, though those categories exist. A deep friend is someone with whom one shares recognition of the good, mutual regard, and a form of co-flourishing. Montaigne later wrote of friendship with that rare combination of tenderness and intelligence that makes every other description look underdressed. Friendship matters philosophically because it challenges the image of the self as sealed unit. We become through relation. We are known by another in ways impossible from within self-enclosure. Friendship is not the disappearance of solitude, but its dignified companion. It also complicates ethics beautifully. We claim impartial morality, then find ourselves caring particularly, concretely, stubbornly about certain people. Is that bias, virtue, or simply the human condition refusing neat universal formulas? Usually, all three are present. Love, likewise, is impossible to exile from philosophy, no matter how often certain traditions try dressing it in colder language. Love raises questions of value, recognition, desire, dependency, self-transcendence, vulnerability, embodiment, and the strange phenomenon by which another person's flourishing becomes internal to one's own. Philosophers argue about whether love perceives value or projects it, whether it is rational or partially lawless, whether it narrows judgment or reveals the beloved more truly. There is truth in each direction. Love can idealize. Love can also see a person more carefully than detached appraisal ever would. It can make fools. It can make saints. Usually it makes tired people trying very hard to be decent despite the weather of feeling. Bedtime history channels may not always linger on such matters, but sleepy philosophy cannot avoid them. If meaning is relational, then love is not sentimental garnish, but structural substance. Even our concepts of justice and self-respect are altered by the fact that humans are attached creatures. Independence is real. So is interdependence. To deny either is to build theories for imaginary beings. Another quiet room in the building is aesthetics, the philosophy of beauty and art. Beauty has often been treated as luxurious, secondary, or suspiciously subjective, yet human life arranges itself around it more than it admits. We decorate shelters. We shape stories. We respond to symmetry and rupture, to harmony and intensity, to tone, color, rhythm, proportion, surprise. Even the people who insist beauty is trivial often reveal elaborate preferences about architecture, language, clothing, music, or the arrangement of a plate. Aesthetics asks what beauty is, whether it is objective or relational, whether art represents reality, transforms it, critiques it, consoles it, or invents fresh modes of seeing. At bedtime, aesthetics becomes particularly gentle. A calm voice, a slow cadence, dim light on a wall, the faint order of sentences unfolding without urgency, all of these are aesthetic conditions. Beauty is not merely in grand cathedrals or symphonies. It is also in restraint, in the proportion of a room, in the humane tempo of speech, in the shape of a thought that lands quietly and stays. Some philosophers fear beauty because it can seduce without truth. That is fair. Propaganda can be beautiful. Cruelty can wear elegance. This is why aesthetics cannot be entirely separated from ethics. What attracts us shapes us. What we repeatedly behold trains desire and attention. The soul, if one dares use that old word without making a scene, acquires the texture of what it loves, which leads, slowly, to habit. Philosophy has always known that ideas alone do not make lives. Habits do. One may believe in moderation and still live chaotically. One may praise honesty and still perform small daily evasions. Character is sedimented action. Repetition becomes disposition. Aristotle understood this with irritating clarity. We become just by doing just acts, temperate by temperate acts, brave by brave acts. Not once, heroically, under cinematic conditions, but repeatedly in ordinary settings with imperfect enthusiasm. This is both bad news and good news. Bad, because one cannot think oneself into virtue while behaving otherwise. Good, because transformation need not begin grandly. A life changes by pattern before it changes by mythology. The same is true of thought. If your mental habits are catastrophic, suspicious, vain, or frantic, your philosophy of life will likely follow. Hence the importance of mental discipline in Stoicism, mindfulness traditions, and even modern cognitive approaches. Philosophy here becomes practical housekeeping for the inner rooms. Sweep the assumption. Dust the resentment. Open a window in the chamber where envy has been making itself comfortable. Not glamorous work. Essential work. We should pause in another room marked politics, because even sleepy minds live under institutions. Political philosophy is not only about elections, constitutions, and theories of justice in thick books. Nobody finishes on buses. It is about how collective life is arranged, who gets heard, who bears cost, what counts as fairness, how power hides in procedures, and why public language so often disguises private interests with exhausting confidence. Power is one of the most philosophically important realities precisely because it dislikes being examined. It prefers to appear natural, inevitable, efficient, traditional, or merely practical. But philosophy asks, practical for whom? Natural to whom? Inevitable, according to which assumptions? Critical theory, feminist philosophy, post-colonial thought, and other traditions widened this questioning by showing that domination does not always look like overt command. It can look like norms, categories, silences, distribution, habits of attention, default perspectives, masquerading as neutrality. Even language can carry sedimented power. To call something normal may already exclude. To call someone emotional may already rank. Philosophy, at its best, notices these quiet architectures. This is one reason it remains relevant no matter how often it is declared obsolete by impatient centuries. The world keeps changing costumes, but the underlying questions of power, truth, dignity, and personhood keep returning. There is a related concept, ideology, which refers to the network of ideas, values, narratives, and assumptions through which social reality is interpreted, justified, or concealed. Ideology is not merely what other people have, though humans are fond of that belief. It is the water one swims in while discussing water with suspicious certainty. One of ideology's favorite tricks is making historical arrangements feel natural. Wages, gender roles, status hierarchies, models of success, ideas of productivity, images of the good life, all can acquire the aura of obviousness simply by repetition. Philosophy disrupts this by restoring contingency. This arrangement had a history. It could have been otherwise. It may yet become otherwise. Such thought can be liberating and destabilizing in equal measure. If the world is not inevitable, then responsibility grows, but so does possibility. Not every philosophy is modern, of course, and the older traditions retain their quiet power at night. The Greeks are still here with their questions about virtue, form, friendship, and the polis. The Romans are still practicing endurance and style in adversity. Medieval thinkers are still laboring through questions of being, God, soul, and universals by candlelight. Islamic philosophers preserved, transformed, and extended classical thought while weaving it through theology, logic, medicine, and metaphysics. Indian philosophical traditions developed highly sophisticated inquiries into self, perception, suffering, liberation, language, and reality. Chinese traditions explored harmony, ritual, spontaneity, social order, virtue, and the Tao, with a seriousness that never required theatrical anxiety to prove depth. Philosophy is not a single line marching westward in dusty sandals. It is a vast conversation with regional architectures, overlapping concerns, and different temperaments regarding order, transcendence, selfhood, and practice. Even the question, what is the self, does not receive a single civilizational answer. Some traditions emphasize an enduring soul or rational agent. Others emphasize interdependence, impermanence, and the illusion of a fixed self. Some aim at harmony within role and relation. Others prize authenticity against convention. Some pursue liberation through knowledge. Others through action, devotion, meditation, or ritual cultivation. The diversity matters because it loosens the provincial arrogance that often mistakes familiarity for necessity. If one way of imagining personhood feels natural to you, that may say more about upbringing than metaphysics. Yet the differences are not merely decorative multiculturalism. They carry practical consequences. If the self is relational, then ethics centers relationship differently. If suffering arises from attachment to fixed identity, then certain remedies follow. If harmony outranks assertion, politics shifts. If liberation lies in seeing through egoic grasping, then success acquires a strange and more fragile status. Bedtime is perhaps a good time to remember that your own mind is not the only template a human mind can inhabit. Humility can be almost cooling. Let us also visit the philosophy of religion, not in a combative mood, but in its quieter form. Human beings have long asked whether ultimate reality is personal, impersonal, divine, absent, silent, loving, indifferent, or beyond such categories entirely. Arguments for and against God have occupied centuries: cosmological, teleological, ontological, moral, experiential, skeptical, evidential. Some find the idea of God explanatory, grounding order, morality, being, or meaning. Others find it unnecessary or incoherent. Some traditions understand the divine not as a cosmic manager, but as being itself, the ground of existence, the source beyond objects. Others stress practice over doctrine, transformation over proof. Philosophy's role here is not merely to score points, but to clarify what is being claimed, what follows from it, what problems remain, and how language strains when directed at ultimacy. Even atheism, when thoughtful, is not simply rejection, but an account of reality and value without transcendence. And even belief, when thoughtful, must wrestle with evil, suffering, hiddenness, and the fact that human interpretations of the sacred are often entangled with politics, desire, and error. None of this resolves easily, which may actually suit bedtime better than triumphal certainty. The night is a more hospitable environment for unresolved majesty than noon. Then there is death again, because philosophy never stops returning to it, and perhaps rightly. Epicurus famously argued that death is nothing to us because when we are, death is not, and when death is, we are not. A fine piece of reasoning, not always emotionally persuasive at 2 a.m, but admirable. Heidegger treated being toward death as a structure that can individualize existence and recall us from the anonymous drift of everydayness. The Stoics urged familiarity with mortality to reduce fear and sharpen values. Religious philosophies interpret death through judgment, release, reincarnation, return, or transformation. Modern secular thought often oscillates between denial and obsession. But whatever the framework, mortality does important philosophical work. It exposes what matters by removing the fantasy of endless postponement. It reveals dependency and vulnerability. It humbles systems. It reminds the busiest person that they, too, are not exempt from ending, however impressive their calendar may currently look. Strangely, this can make life gentler. Small vanities begin to lose some authority under the pressure of finitude. A leaf in evening light may recover significance simply because it is not permanent. The finite is not only tragic, it is precious. Memory belongs nearby. Memory is not just storage. It is active reconstruction, narrative shaping, emotional coloring, selective illumination, and sometimes loyal distortion. The self depends on memory for continuity, yet memory is unstable. We revise even as we recall. We forget strategically, protectively, or just because the mind is a practical editor with strange priorities. Philosophy asks whether personal identity can rest on such a shifting foundation. But memory also matters ethically and politically. Whole societies remember selectively. Nations tell stories about themselves. Families curate legends. Institutions archive what flatters them and misplace what accuses them. Memory, then, is never just private. It is one of the media in which justice or denial persists. To remember rightly is not always to remember comfortably. Bedtime, though, encourages a softer version of this inquiry. What memories govern you without formal invitation? Which scenes return with excessive authority? Which old remarks still occupy too much rent-free space in the architecture of self-judgment? Philosophy cannot delete memory, unfortunately. It can, however, reinterpret significance. A shameful moment may no longer define essence. A past self may be seen historically rather than judicially. Development becomes possible once memory is placed inside time rather than embalmed as permanent verdict. Another concept drifting quietly beside memory is narrative. Humans understand themselves partly through story, not because life is literally fiction, though some weeks make a persuasive attempt, but because events need interpretation, sequence, emphasis, and relation to become intelligible. Narrative identity theorists suggest that a self is, in part, the story one can tell about one's life. But stories can imprison as well as orient. I am the one who fails. I am the responsible one. I am the difficult one. I am the one who always leaves. These narratives may simplify complexity into identity and then defend themselves by selective recollection. Philosophy can interrupt that by asking, who authored this story? What evidence sustains it? Whose voice is missing? What alternatives remain untold? A person is not infinitely malleable, but neither are they a single exhausted sentence. Language changes reality because the stories through which one interprets action affect future action. This is not mere positive thinking in cleaner clothes. It is hermeneutics applied inwardly. Then there is authenticity, that slippery existential virtue people praise with alarming confidence. To be authentic is often imagined as simply being yourself, but philosophy has never found matters that easy. Which self? The impulsive one, the reflective one, the socially shaped one, the desired self, the defensive self, the child self preserved in amber, the aspiration still under construction? Authenticity cannot merely mean expressing whatever arises. That would grant far too much authority to passing weather. Nor can it mean rejecting all social norms, since humans are formed through language, culture, and relation from the start. A deeper authenticity may involve honest appropriation of one's condition. To own, rather than simply inherit one's values, roles, and choices, even while acknowledging that complete self-creation is a fantasy beloved by people selling expensive notebooks. Authenticity is less spontaneous overflow than disciplined truthfulness toward one's actual situation. It includes limits. It includes history. It includes the realization that one is not obliged to perform a dramatic uniqueness at all times in order to count as real. Relief may be found there. Performance, after all, is exhausting. Modern life produces a good deal of it. Social roles are not themselves false. Every society uses them, but there is a difference between inhabiting a role and disappearing into it. The professional self, competent and polished. The family self, dutiful or evasive. The public self, humorous and manageable. The inner self, less coherent than marketing materials suggest. Philosophy asks whether there is a center among these or merely a negotiated field. Goffman, though often placed under sociology, helped illuminate the theatrical structure of social life. Foucault showed how persons are shaped by discourses, institutions, and regimes of power that produce what counts as normal, healthy, deviant, confessible, visible. Suddenly the self appears not as isolated origin, but as an ongoing product of forces and practices. This can sound defeating until one notices that seeing the machinery creates some possibility of freedom from total enchantment. If you know how you are being shaped, you are not automatically liberated, but you are less asleep. And that in this entire sleepy journey may be the central philosophical motion, becoming less asleep to what one is doing, thinking, assuming, repeating, serving, fearing, and loving. Not hyper-vigilant, not tense, not endlessly self-monitoring like an exhausted security guard inside the psyche. Just less asleep, more present, more accurate, more proportionate. Philosophy at its best is not a pile of difficult nouns, but a training in wakefulness. This includes moral wakefulness. Consider how easily persons become categories in busy minds. Customer, rival, problem, audience, voter, patient, child, elderly person, colleague, stranger, useful contact. Philosophy pushes back by asking what a person is, what dignity demands, whether one can ever justify treating someone merely as a means, how structural conditions alter responsibility, how empathy and justice differ, yet need each other. Emmanuel Levinas, for example, gave tremendous weight to the face of the other, the encounter that interrupts self-centered freedom with ethical demand. One need not follow every step of his language to feel the force of the idea. Another person is not just an object in your map. Their presence places a claim on you. In a world skilled at instrumentalization, this is no small reminder. The same goes for suffering. To think philosophically about suffering is not to romanticize it, which is a particularly bad habit of certain traditions on insufficient sleep. It is to ask what suffering reveals, what kinds are avoidable, what structures produce it, what responses honor it without making it into spectacle, and whether there are forms of meaning compatible with pain rather than dependent on its glorification. Buddhism begins from suffering as a central fact and examines craving, impermanence, and liberation. Schopenhauer saw suffering as woven deeply into desire itself. Nietzsche warned against making pain into proof of metaphysical guilt, while also insisting that difficulty and struggle can participate in growth under certain conditions. Contemporary ethics asks about care, vulnerability, dependency, and the social distribution of suffering. None of this abolishes pain, but it can make us less foolish in its presence. Wisdom is often just diminished foolishness practiced consistently. That may be an underwhelming slogan, but night is a good time for realistic slogans. We have not yet lingered long enough over wisdom itself. Wisdom differs from intelligence, from information, from argumentative skill, from verbal fluency, from the ability to win discussions at dinner and then wonder why no one invites you back. Wisdom concerns judgment in living. It knows proportion, it senses timing, it sees which truth is needed now and which, though technically correct, would merely wound or show off. It carries memory without being trapped in it. It keeps principles without flattening circumstances. Wisdom is difficult to systematize because it is partly responsive rather than procedural. This is why many philosophies ultimately return to the figure of the sage, the virtuous person, the enlightened one, the person of practical wisdom, rather than only a list of doctrines. Knowing the right theory of courage is not the same as becoming courageous. The wise person embodies integration, and integration may be one of the most soothing philosophical words. A fragmented life is tiring. Different selves pull in opposite directions. Values are declared but not enacted. Desires conflict with judgments. Time is chopped into transactions. Attention is sold in fragments. The result is not merely inefficiency, but a weakened sense of being truly present anywhere. Integration means the parts begin, at least somewhat, to speak to one another. Beliefs match actions more often. Desires are educated rather than obeyed blindly. Roles serve a life rather than replace it. Rest becomes possible because constant internal contradiction softens. No one achieves perfect integration, and anyone claiming to have done so should immediately be handed a broom and a skeptical glance. But movement toward integration is one of philosophy's gentlest promises. A more coherent life feels lighter from the inside. Perhaps that is what so many traditions, despite their vast differences, are reaching toward, some form of alignment between truth, action, and being. We can think here of the Taoist sage moving with the grain of reality rather than forcing against it, of the Stoic aligning will with nature and reason, of the Aristotelian harmonizing desire and virtue, of the contemplative tradition seeking union or surrender, of the existentialist demanding ownership of choice, of the critical thinker trying to see through ideological distortion. Different languages, different metaphysics, different tempers, and yet all, in one sense, asking how a human being might live without being at war with reality, others, and themselves all at once. This may be impossible in pure form. Still, the direction matters. Sometimes philosophy is less about possessing truth than orienting toward it. That word, orientation, deserves a pillow of its own. In dark rooms, orientation is everything. You may not know every object precisely, but if you know where the door is, where the bed is, where not to step with your bare foot, you can move with enough trust to avoid catastrophe. Philosophy offers orientation amid uncertainty, not comprehensive control, not guaranteed happiness, not elimination of grief, not a perfect answer sheet distributed by benevolent cosmic administrators. Orientation, a sense of what matters, what can be known, what deserves doubt, what kind of beings we are, what responsibilities follow, what illusions to beware, what goods are worth effort, what fears deserve less obedience than they currently receive. That is already a great deal, enough perhaps to soften a night, enough to reduce panic without denying reality, enough to help a person live inside questions without being devoured by them. And because this is bedtime, we can now let even these deeper corridors quiet down. Let political theory stop reorganizing the city for one evening. Let metaphysics dim its chandeliers. Let language loosen its grip on reference. Let authenticity stop supervising your entire biography. Let mortality sit at a respectful distance, no less true for being quiet. Let memory place its boxes gently back on the shelf. Let wisdom, if it arrives at all, do so without entrance music. You do not need to solve the self before sleeping. The self is busy enough becoming and unbecoming on its own. You do not need to decide finally between realism and anti-realism while horizontal. The furniture will continue existing or not without your immediate intervention. You do not need to settle free will tonight. If your thoughts are determined, they will pass. If they are free, they may also pass. Either way, passing remains available. Perhaps this is a final, very small philosophical gift for the night, the recognition that not every thought requires prosecution. Some can be witnessed and allowed to go. The Stoics would approve, though in a disciplined Roman manner. The Buddhists would also approve, though with rather different metaphysical paperwork. Even modern psychology, arriving late to the party with sensible shoes, has rediscovered what older traditions knew, that the mind need not identify with every event it produces. A thought is not a command. A mood is not an essence. A fear is not a prophecy. Consciousness contains weather. Identity need not become every cloud. And so, as the room grows quieter, philosophy itself can become less like a lecture hall and more like a long exhale. The great questions remain, yes, what is real? What is good? What are we? How should we live? Why anything at all? But they need not be barked under fluorescent light. They can be held softly like lanterns with shutters half closed. You can let them warm the mind without demanding that they finish their work before dawn. Perhaps that is maturity in thought, not frantic certainty, not cynical withdrawal, but a calm companionship with depth, to know that reality exceeds you, to know that this is not humiliation, but condition, to live inside that condition with some courage, some humor, some kindness, some willingness to revise, some patience with mystery, and, when possible, some ability to sleep. The philosophers themselves often lack that last gift, which is unfortunate, but you are not required to repeat all their errors merely because they were historically influential. You may let the concept settle now. Let wonder remain wonder without immediately becoming a project. Let truth remain worthy without becoming a weapon. Let justice remain necessary without demanding that your entire nervous system administer the universe tonight. Let the self loosen a little at its borders. Let time stop being a staircase and become simply a dark river carrying this hour gently onward. Let consciousness rest at the edge of itself. Let meaning be less like a hidden object and more like a quiet pattern that does not vanish, merely because you stop staring at it for a while. Somewhere beyond your noticing, the ancient conversation continues. Socrates is still asking inconvenient questions. Aristotle is still sorting virtues with grave patience. Epictetus is still reminding people to distinguish what they can and cannot control. Epicurus is still preferring bread, friendship, and peace to theatrical ambition. Nagarjuna is still dismantling fixed views with breathtaking calm. Confucius is still teaching that character grows in relation and ritual. Laozi is still stepping aside so that force can reveal its limits. Augustine is still restless. Spinoza is still serene in geometry. Kant is still severe in duty. Nietzsche is still hammering idols and occasionally furniture. Beauvoir is still refusing the reduction of persons to roles. Camus is still walking under a bright and indifferent sky, insisting on dignity without illusion. They are all still there in their respective rooms of the old building, and yet none of them can sleep for you. This part, at last, is yours. To lie down inside uncertainty without immediate revolt, to permit incompleteness, to let the unfinished stay unfinished until morning, to trust that a human life need not close every philosophical loop in order to be real, decent, and meaningful. It is enough, for now, that you are here, a mind among minds, a brief consciousness under a large night, a being capable of asking questions, making promises, remembering, regretting, laughing dryly at the absurd, caring for others, misreading situations, revising beliefs, noticing beauty, and growing slowly wiser if luck, effort, and honesty collaborate. That is already astonishing. Strange, vulnerable, incomplete, temporary, yes, but astonishing. And because it is astonishing, perhaps it deserves gentleness, not indulgence without truth, not harshness without mercy. Gentleness, the kind that allows a person to be finite without contempt, the kind that knows thought can illuminate without tyrannizing, the kind that understands rest is not betrayal of seriousness. Even philosophy, after all, benefits from a quieter room. So the building dims, the halls empty. The concepts fold themselves into shadow. In one room, reason places its papers in a neat stack. In another, wonder looks out the window at the dark. In another, freedom removes its boots and finally sits down. Time passes without asking permission. Memory closes a drawer. Justice lowers its voice. Meaning does not disappear. It simply stops insisting. And somewhere near the center of this large old house, where self and world meet in the temporary miracle of awareness, the mind loosens enough to drift. Not because every question has been answered, but because questions need not always be solved to become bearable. Sometimes it is enough to have walked with them calmly for a while. Sometimes it is enough to know that humans before you have done the same, and that tomorrow, if needed, the doors will still be there, the rooms still waiting, the old conversation still available, mildly patient, faintly amused, and very, very far from over.